I almost walked past the journal. If I had, none of this would have happened. I would have spent one quiet night under the pines, hiked back to my truck the next morning, and this place would have become nothing more than another pin on a map I'd eventually forget. Instead, I opened it, and somewhere inside those pages, someone had already predicted almost everything I was about to do. I've been backpacking alone for close to 10 years. People always ask if I'm ever scared. The truth is, not really. The wilderness makes sense. If you respect it, prepare for it, and know your limits, most problems have straightforward solutions. Weather changes. You adapt. A trail washes out. You reroute. A bear wanders through camp. You give it space. People like to imagine the woods are full of monsters. In my experience, the most dangerous thing out there has always been another person. That's why I keep my trips quiet. No live location. No social media posts until I'm home. Only one person ever knows exactly where I'm going. My younger sister, Nora. Every Friday before I leave, she sends the same text. Promise me one thing. I always answer the same way. I know. If something feels wrong, I leave. She replies with a thumbs up every time. It had become our little tradition. Looking back, I wish I'd kept that promise. Hollow Ridge Basin wasn't famous. It wasn't even marked on most hiking maps. I found it buried inside an old backpacking forum while looking for less crowded trails. The original post was almost 7 years old. Most of the replies talked about trout fishing or wildflowers. Only one comment stood out. Simply read, "Beautiful place. Read the journal before dark." No one asked what journal. No one replied. The account hadn't posted anything else since. I figured it was some inside joke. The trailhead sat at the end of an abandoned logging road nearly 3 hours from the nearest town. When I arrived just after sunrise, only one vehicle was parked there. An old green pickup. Dust coated the windshield so thickly that someone had written a smiley face across it with their finger. It looked like it had been sitting there for weeks, maybe longer. I checked the parking permit clipped beneath the wiper. Blank. No name. No date. Probably forgotten. I adjusted my backpack and started hiking. The first 5 miles were exactly what I'd hoped for. Tall white pines, cold streams, enough birdsong that the forest never felt empty. Around noon, I stopped for lunch beside a fallen cedar. As I unpacked my food, I noticed a shallow carving on the trunk. Not initials, not a date, just one sentence. Keep your fire small. It wasn't fresh. The bark had started growing around the letters. I smiled. Someone with strong opinions about campfires, apparently. After eating, I kept moving. About 40 minutes later, I found another carving. Different tree. Different handwriting. Don't stay twice. That one made me stop. I looked around. Nothing. Just trees. Wind. A squirrel scrambling overhead. Probably another bored camper. Still, I found myself checking behind me before continuing. The trail narrowed as it dropped into the basin. The temperature seemed to fall with it. Not dramatically, just enough that I zipped my jacket halfway. I reached the clearing a little after 4. It looked almost untouched. A narrow creek curved around one side. A stone fire ring sat near the center. The grass was short enough to pitch a tent almost anywhere. No trash, no beer cans, no broken branches. Cleaner than most established campsites. Felt maintained. I couldn't explain why, just maintained. I dropped my pack beside the fire ring and took a slow walk around the clearing before setting up. That's something I always do. Check for widowmakers. Look for animal tracks. Find a flat place to sleep. Halfway around the clearing, I noticed something odd. There were at least 6 old tent pads. Perfectly flat rectangles where people had clearly camped over the years. but every single one faced the same direction, toward the northern tree line, not toward the creek, not toward the sunrise, just the trees. I couldn't think of a practical reason for that. I shrugged it off. People tend to copy whoever camped there before. Maybe the first camper had picked that direction, and everyone else followed without thinking. By the time my tent was standing, the afternoon sun had started slipping behind the ridge. I collected firewood, filtered water, cooked a simple dinner. Everything felt normal again, peaceful. I almost forgot about the carvings. As I searched for one last armful of dry branches near the fire ring, my boot struck something buried beneath the leaves. Not a rock, wood. I knelt and brushed the leaves aside. A weatherproof metal box, army green, about the size of a lunch container. There wasn't a lock, just two rusted clasps. Someone had scratched a single word across the lid. Read. I hesitated. The box clearly hadn't ended up there by accident. It had been placed beneath the edge of the fire ring where almost every camper would eventually find it. Curiosity got the better of me. I unclipped the clasps. Inside sat a waterproof journal, pencil, and dozens of folded notes held together with a faded rubber band. On the inside cover, written neatly in black ink, were the words, "If you're camping here tonight, read every entry before the sun goes down. Don't skip ahead." Every person who ignored that rule regretted it. I glanced toward the western ridge. The sun was already touching the tops of the pines. I looked back at the journal. For a second, I actually considered closing the box and walking away. Then I laughed at myself. People really commit to these camping traditions. I picked up the journal, turned to the first page, and immediately realized this wasn't a guest book. The very first line read, "If you're reading this, I need you to do something before anything else. Count how many campsites you can see." I frowned. Slowly, I looked up from the page and scanned the clearing again. My tent, the old fire ring, the creek, the empty meadow. Then my eyes drifted farther left, to a patch of flattened grass I could have sworn hadn't been there 5 minutes earlier. It looked exactly like another campsite, as if someone had packed up a tent, only moments before I arrived. I counted again. 1, my tent. Then 2. About 40 yards to my left, just beyond the creek, the grass had been pressed perfectly flat into a rectangle. Not naturally, not by animals, by a tent. The corners were too clean, the edges too straight. Whoever had camped there had packed up recently enough that the grass hadn't started standing back up. That wasn't unusual by itself. What was unusual was that I hadn't noticed it earlier. I'd walked that side of the clearing while collecting firewood. I would have bet my truck that the patch hadn't been there. I lowered the journal and stared at it for nearly a minute. Finally, I convinced myself there was only one reasonable explanation. I'd overlooked it. Simple as that. My attention had been on setting up camp, not studying the ground. I almost laughed at how quickly my mind had started filling in gaps. I turned back to the journal. The next paragraph read, "You'll probably think the second campsite was always there. That's what I told myself too. Go look at it. Then come back before sunset." I frowned. The words felt less like a warning and more like instructions. Against my better judgment, I crossed the creek. The ground was still damp from the water. My boots left clear prints in the mud. I noticed that immediately because there weren't any others. If someone had packed up only a few hours ago, there should have been tracks leading away. There weren't. The flattened patch sat alone. No fire ring. No broken branches. No scraps of cord. Nothing. Just the unmistakable outline of where a two-person tent had stood. Near one corner, something caught my eye. A titanium tent stake. It had been driven almost completely into the ground. I pulled it free. Expensive. The kind backpackers don't usually leave behind. Especially not by accident. Someone had been in a hurry. Or they'd wanted someone to find it. I slipped it into my pocket. Then I headed back. I didn't like how dark the trees were becoming. Sunset was still 20 minutes away, but the basin already felt as if evening had arrived early. Back at my campsite, I sat on a log and opened the journal again. The entries weren't organized by date. Instead, every writer had numbered their page. Entry 4, Entry 11, Entry 23, Entry 41, as if dozens of different people had continued the same conversation over many years. The handwriting changed constantly, some neat, some barely readable, but every entry followed one rule. Nobody described exactly what happened. They only described what changed. Entry 9. My cooking pot was clean when I came back from collecting water. Entry 17. Someone folded my tarp better than I ever could. Entry 28. The zipper on my tent was closed. I always leave it open during the day. Entry 34. My flashlight batteries were fully charged. I know they were almost dead. None of them explained why those things mattered. None of them mentioned seeing another person. The final sentence of every entry was almost identical. Leave after the first night. Not run. Not they're coming. Just leave. I checked my watch. 6:41. The sun had almost disappeared behind the ridge. The basin grew noticeably quieter. Not because birds had stopped singing, because there hadn't been any birds for several minutes. I hadn't noticed exactly when the sounds disappeared. That unsettled me. Silence usually arrives gradually in the woods. This felt instant. I stood to stretch. My knees cracked. The sound echoed farther than it should have. Then another sound answered it. A single knock, wood against wood. 3 quick taps, somewhere deep in the northern trees. I froze. Nothing followed. No footsteps. No voices. Just silence. I waited almost a full minute before convincing myself it had probably been a branch shifting in the wind. Except there wasn't any wind. The tops of the pines were completely still. I decided I wasn't going to let a notebook dictate my evening. I lit a small cooking stove instead of a campfire. The blue flame hissed softly as I boiled water. Instant coffee. Freeze-dried chili. Normal routine. Normal thoughts. That's what I needed. While the water heated, I took out my satellite messenger to send Nora my usual check-in. Made camp. Everything's good. I pressed send. The loading icon spun, then stopped. Message failed. Not surprising. Heavy tree cover blocked satellite signals all the time. I set it beside my backpack to try again later. A few minutes later, the water boiled. I poured the coffee, stirred it, sat down, reached for my spoon. It wasn't there. I searched the ground around me. Nothing. I emptied my cooking pouch. Nothing. I knew I'd packed it. I always kept it in the same place. I sighed. You're tired. That had to be it. I'd misplaced it. I finished eating without it. As twilight settled over the basin, I packed away the stove. That's when I noticed something that instantly erased every rational explanation I'd been telling myself. My satellite messenger was gone. Not buried beneath something. Not kicked into the grass. Gone. I stood so quickly that the coffee spilled across the fire ring. I searched everywhere. Inside my tent. Around my backpack. Beneath the log where I'd been sitting. Nothing. Then I remembered. I'd left it beside my backpack. Exactly 1 step from where I was sitting. I walked to my pack. The top flap was still buckled shut. Exactly as I'd left it. Slowly, I unclipped it. Inside, resting neatly on top of my sleeping bag, was the satellite messenger. I stared at it. I hadn't put it there. I would have had to unbuckle the pack, open the drawstring, place it inside, then close everything again. I would have remembered doing that, wouldn't I? My hands felt strangely cold as I picked it up. Something was underneath it, a folded piece of paper, not from the journal. Fresh, white. I unfolded it. There were only 6 words. You should have left before sunset. For the first time since arriving, I stopped thinking about who wrote the journal and started thinking about who was still close enough to know exactly what I had been doing. The forest stayed completely silent. Then, somewhere beyond the northern tree line, I heard the unmistakable sound of a zipper being closed, very slowly, on a tent that wasn't mine. This is getting stronger. One thing I want to keep improving is realism. Rather than stacking too many impossible events, the fear should come from things that could happen if someone had been secretly watching the narrator for hours. That makes viewers think, what if this happened to me? I didn't sleep, not even for a minute. After hearing that zipper, I switched off my headlamp and sat motionless inside the tent. The notebook lay open across my lap. Every few minutes I found myself reading the same sentence again. Leave after the first night. The silence outside became its own kind of noise. Every small sound demanded attention. Pine cone dropping, the creek moving over rocks, the tent fabric settling as the temperature fell. I kept expecting another zipper, another knock, another note. Nothing came. Around midnight, I realized I was gripping the handle of my flashlight so tightly that my hand had started cramping. I forced myself to relax. If someone was trying to scare me, I wasn't going to make their job easier. At some point, exhaustion finally won. Not real sleep, the kind where your eyes close for seconds at a time before you jolt awake again. The first light of morning filtering through the tent felt like relief. For the first time in 12 hours, I could actually see beyond the fabric. I unzipped the door carefully. The basin looked exactly as it had yesterday. The creek, the fire ring, the metal journal box. Nothing had changed. At least, that's what I thought. Until I looked at my boots. They weren't where I'd left them. Every night I placed them just inside the tent door. Instead, they were sitting side by side outside, perfectly lined up, facing the northern tree line. I stared at them for several seconds. Maybe I'd kicked them during the night. I wanted that explanation to be true. Then I remembered something. I'd zipped the tent completely before trying to sleep. There was no way the boots could have ended up outside unless someone had opened the tent. Very carefully, without waking me, my stomach tightened. I stepped out and immediately checked the ground. The grass around my tent held almost no impressions. It had dried overnight, but just beyond the edge of camp, I found one boot print, deep, sharp, larger than mine. The tread wasn't from a hiking boot. It looked like an old work boot. The print pointed toward the trees. Only one. No second footprint. No trail leading away. Just one perfect impression. Almost like whoever made it had stepped there once, then disappeared onto the harder ground. I photographed it with my camera. Then another. And another from a different angle. Evidence. If nothing else, I wanted proof that I wasn't imagining this. I ate breakfast quickly. No coffee. No lingering. I'd already decided I was leaving. But something bothered me. The notebook. Someone had gone to incredible lengths to hide it. Someone had written in it recently. If I walked away without understanding why, I knew I'd think about it for the rest of my life. So I made a compromise. 1 more hour. I'd search the basin carefully. Then I'd leave. No matter what. I actually laughed to myself. Nora's going to kill me. I could almost hear her voice. 1 hour turns into 3. That's exactly how horror movies start. She wasn't wrong. I searched methodically, not wandering, not chasing strange sounds. I divided the clearing into sections. Creek first, then the southern edge, then the ridge. Nothing. No trash. No camps. No hidden tents. By the time I reached the northern tree line, I was beginning to think I'd overreacted. Then I noticed something that didn't belong. One branch had been cut cleanly, not broken, cut about chest height. Another 20 feet farther in. Then another. They formed a straight line through the trees. Not a trail anyone would notice unless they were looking for it. I followed them. Each cut branch pointed to the next, like silent arrows. Within 5 minutes, I reached a low rock shelf overlooking the entire basin. I stopped cold. The grass on top of the shelf had been flattened. There were empty food wrappers tucked beneath a rock to keep them from blowing away. A crushed water bottle. The remains of a small camouflage tarp folded into a crack. And dozens of cigarette butts. Some old, some fresh. Someone had spent a lot of time here. From that spot, I could see everything. My tent, the fire ring, the journal box, even the place where I'd collected water. If someone had been watching me, this was where they'd done it. I slowly turned in a circle. The trees around the overlook were scarred with shallow knife marks. Not random. Tiny lines. One beneath another. Groups of 5. Like tally marks. There were hundreds of them. I didn't try to count. Then I heard voices. Not close. Farther down the ridge. 2 men. Talking quietly. I couldn't make out the words. Only the rhythm. One spoke. The other answered. They weren't hiking. They weren't calling to each other. They sounded relaxed. Like people who knew exactly where they were. I dropped to one knee without thinking. The conversation drifted closer. A twig snapped. Then another. I stayed completely still. After a minute, the voices stopped. Silence. I waited. 30 seconds. A full minute. Nothing. Finally, I risked lifting my head just enough to look through the brush. Nobody. The ridge was empty. The voices had simply ended. I backed away from the overlook one careful step at a time. I wasn't interested in solving the mystery anymore. I wanted distance. As I reached the basin, I saw my tent still standing exactly where I'd left it. For one brief moment, I felt relieved. Then I noticed the tent door. It was open, only a few inches. I was certain I'd zipped it shut before leaving. I approached slowly. Nothing looked disturbed. My backpack was still there. Sleeping bag, cooking gear. Everything appeared untouched. Then I saw the journal. It wasn't inside the metal box anymore. It was lying neatly in the center of my sleeping bag, open to a page I had never seen before. Across the top, in handwriting different from every other entry, someone had written, "If you're reading this page, you stayed too long." And below it, the ink was still wet. I didn't touch the journal. I just stood there, staring at the fresh ink. It glistened in the morning light. Someone had written those words only moments ago, which meant one thing. Whoever had been watching me had been close enough to enter my tent while I was at the overlook. I slowly looked toward the northern trees. Nothing. No movement. No voices. Just rows of pine trunks standing perfectly still. For the first time since arriving, curiosity disappeared. All I wanted was to leave. I stuffed my sleeping bag into its sack so fast that I had to do it twice. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. The tent came down in less than 3 minutes. I skipped folding it properly and jammed it into my pack. Every few seconds I looked toward the trees. Still nothing. The silence somehow felt worse than footsteps. At least footsteps told you where someone was. Silence meant they were choosing not to let you know. Before leaving, I walked to the fire ring one last time. The metal journal box sat exactly where I'd found it. For several seconds, I debated taking the notebook with me. If I left it, someone else might walk into this basin and never know. If I took it, maybe I'd finally understand what had happened here. I reached for it. Then I remembered something from the very first page. Don't skip ahead. I hadn't, but someone else clearly had. The notebook wasn't meant to explain anything. It was meant to keep people alive. I slid it back into the box, closed the lid, covered it with leaves exactly the way I'd found it. If someone ignored the warnings after that, it wouldn't be because they never had the chance to read them. I adjusted my backpack and started toward the trail. This time I didn't stop, didn't look around, didn't investigate strange sounds. I kept a steady pace. The forest slowly began to feel normal again. Birds returned. Wind moved through the branches. For nearly 40 minutes, nothing happened. I started believing I'd finally put enough distance between myself and the basin. Then I noticed something nailed to a pine tree. It was so weathered it almost blended into the bark. A small square of aluminum, about the size of a playing card. Stamped into the metal were 4 words. Second night is your choice. No government logo, no trail marker, no explanation. Someone had made it, recently enough that the letters hadn't rusted. I didn't stop walking. About another hour later, I reached the old logging road. Relief hit me so suddenly my knees actually felt weak. My truck was exactly where I'd left it. So was the old green pickup. Only now, its driver's door was open. I was certain it had been closed yesterday. I walked past it without looking inside. Whatever answers that truck held, I didn't want them badly enough anymore. I threw my pack into the passenger seat, climbed in, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I turned the truck around, I looked into the rearview mirror one last time. The trailhead was empty. The green pickup, the trees, the road, nothing moved. I drove away. About 40 minutes later, I stopped at the first gas station I'd seen all morning. I called Nora. She answered on the second ring. You actually called before I texted. I laughed, came out sounding tired. I promised I'd leave if something felt wrong. There was a pause. So, I left. She didn't ask questions right away. She knew me well enough to hear something in my voice. You okay? I think so. You don't sound convinced. I will be. At least, I believed that then. When I got home, I unpacked everything onto the garage floor. Habit. Clean the gear. Recharge batteries. Dry the tent. I opened the camera to transfer the photos I'd taken. The boot print. The overlook. The journal box. The cut branches. Everything was there. Then I noticed something strange. There were 68 photos. I remembered taking around 50, maybe fewer. I clicked through them one by one. Most were exactly what I expected, until I reached the final image. My hand froze on the mouse. It was my tent. The night, taken from outside, only a few feet away. The zipper was closed. A soft light glowed through the fabric. I was asleep inside. The timestamp read 2:14 a.m. I checked the next photo. There wasn't one. That was the last image on the memory card. I sat there for a long time trying to remember waking up, trying to remember taking the camera outside, trying to remember anything. Couldn't, because I hadn't taken it. I went back through every previous picture, zooming in, looking at the edges, looking into the trees. Most showed nothing. Then I stopped on a photo of the overlook. At first, I was focused on the flattened grass. Then I noticed something in the lower corner. A boot. Not mine. Just the front of it. Barely visible behind a tree. Whoever it belonged to had been standing only a few feet from where I was taking the picture, watching me while I searched the place they'd been using to watch me. I never saw them. 3 weeks later, I mailed the titanium tent stake I'd found to the local ranger district with a note explaining where I'd discovered it, mostly because I hoped someone might recognize it. About a month after that, I received a short reply. They thanked me for returning the equipment. Then one sentence caught my attention. That stake matches a brand discontinued nearly 11 years ago. 11 years. It had looked almost new. I folded the letter and put it away. I never contacted them again. I've thought about going back. More than once. Every question still bothers me. Who was writing in the journal? Who maintained the campsite? Who watched from the overlook? Why did every entry end with the same warning? Maybe there are answers. Maybe there aren't. But every time I seriously consider returning, I remember that last photograph. Someone stood close enough to hear me breathing, close enough to touch the tent, close enough to take a picture, and they chose not to wake me. Sometimes I think that's the real warning. Not that someone might hurt you, but that there are places deep in the wilderness where people can know everything about you, without you ever knowing they were there. If you've made it this far, thank you for spending part of your day here at the Forgotten Campsite. If you enjoy grounded camping horror that feels like it could really happen, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next story. And if you've ever experienced something in the woods that you still can't explain, not ghosts or monsters, just something deeply unsettling, share it in the comments. I read every one, and some of the most unforgettable stories begin with a real experience. Until next time, stay safe, trust your instincts, and if the last camper leaves you a warning, don't stay long enough to find out why.